Hello and welcome. Susan Corbett, custom machine quilter. This is a quilt of valor made by a guild I belong to. And as you can see, what's going on here is it's a bunch of borders and 4 blocks. So I wanted to quilt it quickly and easily, but this is me we're talking about here. So part of it went quickly, but then some parts of it really did not. But I love the way it turned out. I had so much fun quilting this. I just love it. It's striking and bold and just gorgeous. So after stabilizing all those borders and blocks, I got going on the blue borders. I like to pick a thread color and do all I can in that thread color first before switching. So I put this blue in. It offers a slight contrast, so that's great that I can see what I'm doing, but it doesn't call undue attention to itself. Really, it's the lighter blue that you see in the print of that fabric. So I'm pretty sure I did the math here to figure out how many of those orange peels were going to fit. Since they were going to be larger, I didn't just haul off and freehand them. I used a ruler in this case. And this went pretty fast. So once I got all the orange peels in, I filled in with a little pattern meander. It's a ribbon candy, which I think really makes it. I like all the texture that I was able to impart on this quilt. It really makes it sing. Now, the blue borders in here are various sizes, and that also applies to that red sashing up against it. So that calls for some kind of malleable quilting design choice. The first thing I think of when I need a border that's going to look good in any size is feathers. But for some reason, I didn't think feathers were called for here. In the top border and the very bottom border, I opted for swags. This, being a patriotic quilt, these remind me of bunting. And I did those freehand. Okay, so having done all the blue I could for the moment, I switched to white thread. And there's these 2 borders of flying geese. So I was searching high and low for some design I was going to like in here. And then I thought, I don't need anything more in here than continuous curve. Those pieces are not very big, and that'll be the fastest thing I can do. So the only thing left to decide was a continuous quilting path. So what I did here was quilt all I could in one direction, and then went back in the other direction to finish up. So I got most of the pieces quilted in the first pass, and then the rest was just filling in with a couple of leftover curves here and there. And I didn't switch between white and red thread for expediency, also because that cream colored thread looks great on that white. I switched to red thread for the sashing because there I thought there would be so much of it that a contrast might be distracting, but here it wasn't. So here at the end of the road, there were just a couple of arcs to fill in on the way back. And this part went really quickly. All right, now here, what I wanted for the flag part of the quilt was to make those stripes look like, you know, that quilt is like that flag is flapping in the breeze. So this is a design I've showed before. It's very wavy and beautiful. I like to choose designs that contrast up against each other. And I knew that around this flag, I wanted to do straight lines. So, of course, I had to have curves here in the flag itself. So, what I'm doing is I freehanded a wavy line and then went back and added some curves. And once you get this design down, and you don't really have to think about it too hard, it's great to be able to quilt that whole stripe in one continuous line. My machine has a quirk. It doesn't like to quilt backwards. The thread tends to break. So I quilted the main line, and then I'd quilt back on some of the bars as far as I could until it did break, and then I just went back to quilting from left to right, because that's what it likes. People love this design. I noticed early on in my quilting career the designs that people would get excited about and point at and ooh and ah with delight. And those tended to be the things that had the most movement, which is exactly what you want in a flag. In the red, I opted for the pattern meander version of a big meander, which you can see here in this photo. So moving on to the blocks, and this is just the white fabric. So here I'm doing continuous curve in that little bitty triangle, and then I wanted lines that would radiate from the star, but instead of straight lines, I did curved lines, again, for the movement they add. And I couldn't do it exactly all in one continuous line, so I worked in these little increments. Here, after a while, I'll show how I switched to gold thread, and the gold got used on that gold fabric and in those blue stars. This is a whole new block now. And see that seam. Whoever made this block put that seam in the middle of that square to whip that block out really quickly and get out of having to set in a corner, which is fine, but that presents a design challenge for me as a custom quilter because that seam is going to stick up. Whatever you don't quilt down is going to puff right up, and I don't want that seam to be puffing up. So I chose to do a double continuous curve here with a pattern meander in the middle. And I ended up doing like a pebble and then with a really elongated, I don't know what you call it. So that's what's in this video, but I didn't like it. I went back and ripped those out and replaced it with some ribbon candy instead. I don't normally quilt the background before I do the main part of the block, but in this case, I did. I stitched in the ditch around the star. I don't think I used clear thread. I'm not sure. I don't quite recall. But I like to ditch quilt in something that is not going to show, either a matching thread or something that's dark. Sometimes it doesn't matter what color thread you use. It just needs to either be dark or light. That just depends on the fabric. Okay, now for the non-fast part of the quilting. If you quilt each little individual element, that's going to make for a lot of quilting and a lot of little quilting. And I knew that lines around that flag was going to frame that flag. I just thought that would look really good in here. So I like, when I can, to quilt 3 little borders as one great big border for the visual impact it's going to have. It's a simple design plan for those borders, but it's not a very fast one. One day I realized, well, because my early attempts to do straight lines were so disastrous, they're so easy to mess up. But one day it occurred to me, if I never do them, I'll never be good at them. And it's so good for your design scheme to mix up straight with curves. So then a funny thing happened. I noticed that how the lines were not straight and looked really crooked, flat on the frame. Once I took the quilt off and hung it up and looked at it head on, they didn't look crooked anymore. They looked, well, the eye sees what it wants to see, what it thinks is there, not what's really there. So that emboldened me with straight line work. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be great. it just needs to not look crooked, which is a great thing. So with my drafting tool, that is really handy to get the angles down. And you can see that I did not mark with any kind of a marker. The only marker I ever usually use is chalk, because it brushes right off. Here I marked my stops and starts with flathead pins so I can quilt right over them, and they don't pose a problem. So, as I've said before in other videos, I quilted the middle, the center, and then I like to go back in and stop after a little while, get the corners in, and then quilt the lines in the middle of those two. I can fudge more easily the spaces between the lines in the middles than I can at the corners or in the center. But of course you have to keep up with what you're doing and remember how many lines you quilted. Mindfulness really pays off here. I make mistakes when my mind wanders, when it's on other things and not on the quilting. So, in this design, I've got 3 lines that are close together, 1/8 to 1/4 inch apart, and then about 3/4 of an inch in between those sets of 3 lines. I think that gives me a lovely increment for how that goes. It's not too little. It's not too big. A big mistake I see people make is enormous cross-hatching or lines apart that are, 2 inches apart. That's not enough quilting. Especially if you were doing lines in the background of some applique with little bitty pieces, the background quilting design needs to be smaller than the motif it surrounds. The beauty of this border is that there wasn't miles and miles of it. It was time consuming, but once you get in a groove, a good one, I hope, then it tends to go not near as slow as you might think. And I might take this opportunity to answer a question I've gotten more than once. Why are you putting all this effort into a quilt you're not getting paid for? One, I had the time. I did not have a busy time when I quilted this. But 2, I would have taken the time anyway. I don't do very many free quilts, and I thought this might go to a gold star family. So in that context, this is the least I can do. And I really enjoyed it. I had so much fun doing it. I don't think it was too much effort. Had I designed and done trapunto and all sorts of fancy things, that might have gotten me into under-earning territory, but I was happy to do this. I think the payoff for doing all these lines was just huge. And here I'm using gold thread, so I did more stops and starts than I might have, just because I'm traveling from one line to another in the ditch, and I didn't want a lot of gold thread in that white ditch. It could have taken it in the red and not been such a big deal, or the blue, but the white, it really would have called attention to itself. I could have done all the lines going in the same direction and there wouldn't have been anything wrong with that. I just thought, well, we're framing this flag, so it would be nice to have those lines meet in the middle and change direction that way. I'm using my GAM guide here to get those lines in, but you could use any ruler, or if you have a computerized machine, of course, I guess you can program those to get your lines in for you, so you're not doing all this work. And my machine does not have, like I have one foot, and that's it. That's the ball game. I called the company and asked if I could, if the new feet they have would fit my machine, and they said they didn't know. So I take that to be a no. They won't fit in your machine, not without a big overhaul. So that affects the way I'm going to do some ruler work. You know, I'm having to hold that ruler in ways that other people don't have to. But it's always possible to find a way to cope. And now feast your eyes on the wonderful texture that we ended up with here. I just think it's gorgeous. For a show quilt, I could have done dimensional quilting in the 3/4 inch part, but it looks great all by itself. All right, so with the gold thread in there, now I'm quilting the centers of those blocks. I'm using an arch guide for a curved line or curved lines in the large blue parts of that star. I'm going back to finding a simple, sort of quick way to get these blocks done, not spending a whole lot of time on them. And curves look really good in that star. So I quilted the blue parts before I got to the red and gold. And with this design plan, there's not too much thread in the middle, so I didn't have that problem you sometimes get of having a divot in the middle of a star with a whole bunch of quilting. So the simplest thing I could think of to do in the red and gold fabrics is quilt a straight line up the red, stop and do a little continuous curve in the gold diamonds, and then finish the straight line up at the top. So once again, this does not get you one continuous line throughout the whole star, but it's okay. Not super fast, but definitely simple, and I think pretty darn effective. So where do these ideas come from? Well, continuous curve is just that's a natural go-to. A straight line does not take any creativity. A curved line doesn't take that much more creativity. And really, I quilt intuitively. So I didn't have to plan this quilting out. You know, the ideas just came right before I was going to quilt that part, and that's how it's kind of always worked for me. Some stuff needs planning, but this one didn't. And it looks great. I labored over which gold thread to use. And even though it's a contrasting thread, it's not garish. It doesn't stand out very much, especially the gold on that blue. I mean, you can barely see it. And there is a view of the back. Didn't that turn out pretty? So here's another block, the one where I did continuous curve and the curved radiating lines. Now I'm back to using a ruler to get that same orange peel shape in the gold fabric. See how a harmonious quilting design scheme is starting to take place here. Just using the same elements over and over, but not just one thing. So inside the orange peel, I'm quilting freehand swirls. And that let me go up and down the block and then back to the center without too much trouble. And I switched rulers to a more rounded shape, a deep round curve. And I'm just continuous curving the star. That's all that's happening in that star. In the star, I wish the thread would have shown more than it did, but oh well. And here is the other part of the slow part of quilting this quilt. I switched to red thread. And as I said before, the red sashing is different sizes of pieces. It's wider in some places and thinner in others. So I thought, well, I've done a fair bit of ruler work here. What if I kept on going? And I made it up as I went along, which I love to do. I just trusted that it was going to work out somehow, that it was going to yield something interesting. And I think it did. This was fun and exciting. I think quilting is like solving a puzzle. I wonder what would look good here. What if I did that there? So, this is how I work. Quilt some lines and then see what idea pops into my head next. So I thought, okay, let's continue that orange peel idea in the middle, in the corners. So I measured for the middle and got a smaller ruler and took off making more arches. I like my choice of matching thread. I think some other color would have been distracting. This border design is all about texture. And the curves, I think, soften up all these hard edges. So I felt my way through this sashing little by little. And what you're seeing being quilted here is the last part of it. And here I thought I knew what I was doing. So I left a line out and didn't notice it until I was almost at the very end, and I just couldn't see picking out all those stitches to get that extra line in. It's a good idea to take a picture of what you've already done to refer to when you scroll up and get to the other end of the quilt. But I didn't do that here. I don't think I've ever hauled off and tried something that didn't seem to work out somehow. And it's interesting for somebody with such a huge aversion to math, how much geometry is involved in here. A math teacher told me one time, you probably do like math in some other way. She asked if I'd ever taken geometry, and of course I had not, because you had to get past algebra, which I never could do. In college, I took algebra with football players. That was really sad, and I took it pass fail. But geometry comes alive on a quilt when you can play with angles and rulers and curves and straight lines. This is just all out fun. So I did two sort of concentric arches here, and then decided to fill in with a pattern meander. And I opted for a little tiny swirl since that's what we had happening in other parts of the quilt. Again, striving for a harmonious quilting scheme. Maybe trying to keep it all one continuous line was what threw me off from getting those lines in properly. And I was trying to expedite the quilting because I knew this was taking a lot longer. But there wasn't very much of it on this quilt. That's the saving grace here. It was a fun surprise to quilt this part of the quilt. And that dense fill really makes it sing. When I quilted in this part, that's when I thought, well, what is going on here? This isn't right. What's happening? And that's when I realized I'd left out a line, I think. It may have been when I finished all the dense fill. The great part about it is this is not a show quilt. It doesn't have to be perfect. And at first glance, you don't notice there's a line missing. I know it, but it still looks pretty great. I don't think the recipients are ever going to see it. I hope not. When I'm filling in with swirls or whatever, I like to use different sizes of them. I think it's static if you just use one size. And plus, what fits in the middle is not what's going to fit in those little tight spaces, like in those points. I think you kind of have to use different sizes. It just makes it a lot more interesting. And with the swirl, which I don't think I can quilt without swirling. They're so good. And I can echo them. And that makes it look bigger than they really are. And the echo is a good way to get around a patch. It's a really useful thing. Here's what that should have looked like. I think it's gorgeous. Okay, now there was one last border left out there. I didn't know what to do. I needed a design that was not a long line like in the flag. And I was up against some curves and some straight lines. So what to do? I'm looking through all my sashing ideas, and I saw a Greek key. So if you're a perfectionist and you need perfection, then I would suggest you not try freehanding a Greek key, because it's going to look freehanded. That's when you want a pattern or a computer to do it for you, or hand quilted. For the longest time, I shied away from freehanding Greek keys. Just, I don't know, some designs I just feel really insecure about. But as always, the best cure for that is to sit down with a piece of paper and just do it over and over and over and work it out in your head, how it needs to go. Which I did again here. That seems to happen every single time I want to use it. The thread is matching. I would never attempt this with contrasting thread, because you'd see every little flaw, every little imperfection, every increment that was different than the one before. But this looked great. I love it. And another thing, I'm doing that internal weird math thing my brain knows to do, just to go for it and see if it's going to work out. Most of the time it does. Most of the time I get a really good fit. Rarely am I there picking out stitches, because I ended up with having to stop in mid-motif. This one ended up in a really nice place. It was fast, and I think it's really sensational. I love it. And that's the ball game. That's the whole quilt. I always count hours. It took 10 hours. That was including sewing on the binding and finishing by hand. So not real long. And here's a look at the back. Look how great all those threads look together. And this a picture, when I handed it off to Miriam, who's going to take this quilt to the family who's going to end up with it. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.